Picture this. You're 7 years old, playing with dolls in your family's modest home, when suddenly armed guards arrive at your door. Your parents bow deeply, their faces a mixture of terror and forced joy, as they explain that the most powerful man in the world has chosen you, a child who still needs help braiding her hair, to become his wife. The silk wedding dress they drape over your tiny frame weighs more than you do, and the golden jewelry around your neck feels like chains. You don't understand the whispered conversations about political alliances and territorial agreements. All you know is that tomorrow, you'll be leaving everything you've ever known to marry a man older than your grandfather. This was the reality for Ayşe Hafsa Sultan, a 7-year-old girl who became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, but only after surviving a childhood that would break most adults. Her story isn't just about royal luxury and political intrigue. It's about a child forced to navigate the deadliest court in the world, where a single mistake could mean execution, and where survival required abandoning innocence before you even understood what innocence meant. Before diving into this forgotten tale of childhood sacrifice and imperial power, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind historical glory, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of Ottoman history taught in schools, where harems are portrayed as luxurious spas and child marriages are glossed over as different cultural practices. This is the story of how a 7-year-old girl was transformed into a political weapon, how she learned to wield power from a position of complete vulnerability, and how she ultimately became the mother of an empire, but at a cost that no child should ever have to pay. The year was 1465, and the Ottoman Empire was reaching the height of its power under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The empire stretched across 3 continents, and its military machines seemed unstoppable. But even the most powerful empires are built on foundations of individual human stories. And Ayşe's story begins in a small village in what is now modern-day Ukraine, where her family lived as part of the local nobility, wealthy enough to matter, but not powerful enough to resist when the Ottoman war machine came calling. The selection process was brutal in its efficiency. Ottoman scouts didn't just look for beautiful girls. They sought specific qualities that would serve imperial interests. Intelligence was crucial. A stupid wife could embarrass the Sultan or fail to produce viable heirs. Beauty was important, but it had to be the right kind of beauty. Features that would age gracefully and produce attractive children. Most critically, they needed girls young enough to be completely molded by palace life, old enough to understand basic instructions, but not old enough to have formed strong emotional attachments that might interfere with their loyalty to the empire. Ayşe possessed all these qualities in abundance. Her fair skin and light eyes marked her as exotic in the Ottoman court, where such features were prized for their rarity. Her family's noble blood meant she had been educated in basic literacy and court manners, skills that would prove essential for survival in the palace. But most importantly, she was 7 years old enough to be married under Islamic law, young enough to be completely transformed by her new environment. The negotiation for her hand took place over her head, literally and figuratively. Ottoman officials sat with her parents in the family's main room, while Ayşe played quietly in the corner, occasionally glancing up at the strangers who spoke about her as if she were a particularly valuable horse being evaluated for purchase. The terms were generous by medieval standards. Her family would receive substantial financial compensation, political protection for their remaining children, and the honor of being connected to the imperial family. But generosity is a relative term when you're selling your 7-year-old daughter to a man who already had multiple wives and was known for his volatile temperament. Her parents faced an impossible choice that thousands of families across the empire confronted during this period. refuse the Sultan's offer, and risk not just execution, but the complete destruction of their family line. Accept it and watch their youngest child disappear into a world where they would never see her again, where she would be transformed into someone they wouldn't recognize, where her survival would depend entirely on her ability to please a man famous for his cruelty. They chose survival, theirs, and they hoped hers. The journey to Constantinople was Aishi's first taste of the gilded cage that would define her new existence. She traveled in a covered wagon surrounded by guards, accompanied by older women whose job was to begin her transformation from village girl to imperial bride. These women weren't cruel exactly, but they were relentlessly efficient. They spoke to her in Turkish, refusing to respond when she used her native language. They corrected her posture, her eating habits, the way she walked and sat and held her hands. They began teaching her the complex etiquette of palace life, which officials to bow to, how deeply to bow, what words were forbidden, what topics were dangerous. But perhaps most unsettling were the lessons about her new role as wife. 7-year-old Aishi couldn't fully comprehend what marriage meant, but the women explained in terms she could understand that she now belonged to the Sultan, that her body was his property, that her only purpose was to please him and bear his children. They spoke of these things matter-of-factly, as if describing the weather or the landscape passing outside their wagon. For them, this was simply how the world worked. For Aish, it was the beginning of a fundamental disconnection from her own identity. No? The first glimpse of Constantinople's skyline should have been magnificent. The soaring minarets, the massive domes, the sprawling palace complex that housed the center of imperial power. But Aishi saw it all through the bars of her wagon window, and even at 7 years old, she understood that those beautiful buildings represented a prison more elaborate than any dungeon. The closer they got to the city, the smaller she felt, until she was just a tiny figure being swallowed by the machinery of empire. Topkapi Palace was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The corridors seemed to stretch forever, decorated with tiles and mosaics that caught the light like jewels. Servants moved through these spaces like ghosts, appearing when needed and vanishing just as quickly. The scale was overwhelming, room after room filled with treasures from across the known world, gardens that contained more flowers than her entire village, fountains that played music with their falling water. But beauty, as she quickly learned, could be more terrifying than ugliness when it served to disguise cruelty. The harem quarters where she was housed were exquisite. Silk cushions, golden fixtures, walls painted with scenes of paradise. Yet these beautiful rooms were also carefully designed prisons, with no windows facing the outside world, no doors that weren't guarded, no spaces where a woman could be truly alone with her thoughts. The other women in the harem became her new family, though family is perhaps too generous a term for relationships built on competition and mutual surveillance. There were the Sultan's other wives, women who had once been girls like her, but who now watched her with calculating eyes, trying to determine whether this new child represented a threat to their own positions. There were the concubines, beautiful women from across the empire who competed for the Sultan's attention and the chance to bear his children. And there were the servants, many of whom had once been wives or concubines themselves, but who had fallen from favor and now existed in a strange limbo between slavery and employment. Each group had its own internal hierarchies, its own rules, its own methods for survival. The newest arrivals, like Aish, occupied the bottom rung of every ladder. They had no allies, no established relationships, no understanding of the complex web of loyalties and rivalries that determined daily life in the harem. They were vulnerable in ways that went far beyond their youth, dependent on the mercy of women who had learned that mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. The transformation process began immediately and was more thorough than anything Aishi could have imagined. Her daily routine was meticulously planned to reshape every aspect of her being. She was awakened before dawn for prayers she didn't understand, spoken in Arabic words that felt foreign on her tongue. The women who attended her moved with practiced efficiency, bathing her in perfumed water that smelled nothing like the simple soap her mother had used, dressing her in silk garments that restricted her movement, arranging her hair in elaborate styles that pulled at her scalp and gave her headaches. The food was perhaps the most disorienting change. Gone were the simple meals of her childhood: bread and cheese, vegetables from her family's garden, meat on special occasions. In the palace, every meal was a carefully orchestrated event. Exotic spices burned her throat, rich sauces upset her stomach, and the sheer abundance felt wrong when she remembered her mother rationing their winter stores. The palace servants watched her eat, noting her preferences and reactions, filing away information that would later be used to reward good behavior or punish transgressions. But the most invasive changes were to her mind and spirit. Teams of tutors descended upon her with lessons designed to remake her intellectual and emotional landscape. She learned Turkish with ruthless efficiency, not just the language, but the particular dialect and vocabulary appropriate for imperial circles. Her native tongue was systematically purged from her daily use, until the words her mother had sung to her as lullabies began to fade from memory like half-remembered dreams. Religious instruction occupied hours each day, but this wasn't the gentle introduction to faith that most children received. AC was taught Islamic prayers and practices with the intensity of someone whose spiritual compliance was a matter of political necessity. The imam who instructed her was kind but firm, explaining that her soul's salvation was now intertwined with her loyalty to the empire and its sultan. Every prayer became a declaration of allegiance, every religious observance a public demonstration of her transformation from Christian village girl to Muslim imperial bride. Perhaps most crucially, she received education in the complex social dynamics of palace life. Older women, survivors of decades in the harem, taught her to read facial expressions like maps, to interpret the slightest changes in tone or posture that might indicate shifting alliances or brewing conflicts. She learned which servants could be trusted with small confidences, and which would immediately report her words to higher authorities. She discovered that every conversation was a potential trap, every friendship a possible betrayal. The lessons in feminine accomplishments were equally intense. She learned calligraphy with such precision that her letters looked like works of art. Music, until she could play complex pieces on instruments she'd never seen before arriving at the palace, and poetry, until she could compose verses in Turkish that would have impressed scholars. These weren't hobbies or pleasant diversions. They were survival skills. A wife who could entertain the Sultan with her artistic abilities might capture his interest long enough to secure her position. A woman who bored him might simply disappear one day, her fate never spoken of again. The physical preparation was the most traumatic aspect of her transformation. Palace physicians examined her regularly, monitoring her development with the cold precision of farmers evaluating livestock. They measured her height and weight, assessed her physical maturity, and made detailed notes about her progress toward readiness for marriage consummation. These examinations were conducted with clinical detachment, but for a 7-year-old girl, they represented a constant reminder that her body was no longer her own. It was imperial property being prepared for imperial use. The psychological conditioning that accompanied these physical preparations was perhaps even more damaging. She was repeatedly told that her highest purpose was to please the Sultan and bear his children. Every lesson, every training session, every moment of her day was oriented toward this single goal. Her own desires, fears, or dreams were irrelevant obstacles to be overcome. The women who trained her spoke of the honor she had received, the privilege of being chosen, the glory she would bring to her family name. But beneath their encouraging words, lay an unmistakable threat. Failure to fulfill her role would result in consequences too terrible to imagine. As months passed, Aishi began to internalize these lessons in ways that alarmed even her trainers. She stopped asking about her family, stopped crying at night, stopped expressing any preferences about food or clothing or activities. She became perfectly compliant, anticipating commands before they were given, performing her duties with the mechanical precision of a well-maintained clock. The transformation was so complete that visitors to the harem commented on her remarkable adaptation to palace life. But this apparent success masked a deeper tragedy. The lively, curious child who had arrived from Ukraine was systematically disappearing, replaced by a carefully constructed persona designed to survive in an environment that consumed authentic human emotion like fuel. The real Aishi retreated so deeply into herself that even she began to lose track of where the performance ended, and her genuine self began. The other women in the harem watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Some felt pity for the child who was losing herself so young. Others felt envy at her rapid advancement in the Sultan's favor. Most felt the weary recognition that came from watching their own stories replay in miniature. They had all arrived as young women with their own identities, their own hopes, their own connections to the outside world. They had all learned to bury those aspects of themselves so deeply that resurrection seemed impossible. The Sultan himself remained a distant figure during these preparatory months. Aishi caught glimpses of him during formal ceremonies. A tall, imposing man with intelligent eyes and an aura of absolute authority. When he looked in her direction, which was rarely, his gaze held the same appraising quality she had learned to recognize in everyone around her. She was being evaluated, measured, assessed for her potential value to his empire. The romantic fantasies that some young girls might harbor about their future husbands never had a chance to develop. This was clearly a business transaction, and she was the commodity being prepared for delivery. The wedding preparations began when Aishi turned 8, though the ceremony itself would wait until she was deemed physically ready for marriage. The planning process revealed the true scale of what was happening to her. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a diplomatic event that would be witnessed by representatives from across the known world. Every detail was scrutinized by committees of officials who understood that the empire's reputation was at stake. The wedding dress alone required months of work by the finest seamstresses in Constantinople. Layer upon layer of silk and cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls and precious stones, designed to transform a small girl into a living symbol of Ottoman wealth and power. When Aishi first tried on the completed garment, she could barely move under its weight. The headpiece was so elaborate that it required 2 servants to position it properly. Looking at herself in the polished metal mirrors, she saw not a child, but a decorated doll prepared for display. Aishi Hafsa Sultan's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the foundations of historical power. This wasn't just the tale of one girl's sacrifice. It was the systematic machinery of empire that consumed thousands of children like her, transforming them into instruments of political control while the world celebrated the golden age they helped create. The 7-year-old who played with dolls in a Ukrainian village became the mother of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, one of history's greatest rulers. But that transformation required the death of everything she had been, the burial of her authentic self beneath layers of imperial necessity. Her legacy lived on through her son's reign, through the empire she helped build, through the political alliances her marriage secured. Yet we must ask ourselves, was any of it worth the price of a child's innocence? The palaces still stand, the histories still praise Ottoman achievements, but the ghosts of girls like Aishi whisper through those marble halls, reminding us that behind every empire's glory lies a foundation built on the bones of the powerless. Today, we tell ourselves we've evolved beyond such practices, but have we really? In a world where children still disappear into systems of exploitation, where power still demands sacrifices from the vulnerable, Aishi's story remains painfully relevant. Her voice, silenced centuries ago, still calls across time, demanding that we remember the human cost of the civilizations we admire and the empires we romanticize.